Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Bahraini forces clash with Mourners as Monarch claims doors to dialogue remain open. Syrian opposition strongholds come under renewed assault. And Palestinian prisoners' movement to wage a collective hunger strike. Mosaic, world news from the Middle East begins now.
Well, in Bahrain, clashes have erupted between Saudi-backed forces and anti-regime protesters. The incident happened in several towns and villages outside the capital, Manama. The fighting began after Saudi-backed forces attacked a rally on the third and final day of funeral processions for a man killed by the regime forces several days ago. The demonstrators shouted anti-regime slogans demanding the downfall of the al-Khalifa rule. Well, Bahrain has been witnessing a revolution since mid-February last year. Scores have lost their lives, many of them under torture in prison. Thousands more have been arrested. The protesters want justice and the ouster of the al-Khalifa regime. Bahrain's economic growth has slowed in the final 3 months of 2011 amid growing anti-regime protests. Statistics show that Bahrain's expansion in gross domestic product reduced to 1.3% from 2.2% in the third quarter of 2011. Overall economic growth in the country also halved to 2.2% last year, the worst performance since 1994. Reports say anti-regime protests in Bahrain have forced many banks and shops to close and triggered an outflow of funds. America's unilateral sanctions against Iran over its nuclear energy program seem to have mostly affected the U.S. itself and its closest allies rather than bringing Tehran to its knees. In another show of withdrawal from its harsh stance against Iran, Washington has exempted Japan and 10 European countries from financial sanctions. Here's more.
The administration of U.S. President Barack Obama says the measure was taken because the exempted countries have significantly reduced their oil imports from Iran. In a statement, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton described the list as an initial group, suggesting that more countries could also be exempted. Clinton said she would report to the Congress that sanctions will not apply to financial institutions in these countries for a renewable period of 180 days. The sanctions were intended to punish those who continue to purchase oil from Iran. The 10 European beneficiaries are Belgium, Britain, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and Spain. This is not the first time that Washington is stepping back from its threats against Tehran. Earlier in March, at a time when Israel was beating the drums of war against Iran, Obama warned about the consequences of any military action.
When I see the casualness with which some of these folks talk about war, I'm reminded of the costs involved in war. Those who are suggesting or proposing or beating the drums of war should explain clearly to the American people what they think the costs and benefits would be. I'm not one of those people. At this stage, it is my belief that we have a window of opportunity where this can still be resolved diplomatically.
What Obama said was in direct contradiction with his previous threats that all options are on the table to halt Iran's nuclear energy program. For long, the U.S. has been busy with its propaganda campaign to manufacture an Iranian threat. Washington and its Western allies accuse Tehran of trying to acquire nuclear weapons, an accusation that Tehran vehemently rejects.
The Syrian Revolution's General Commission confirmed that 59 people were killed today in a number of cities, but mostly in Homs, due to the shelling of the neighborhood of al-Qaeda for the second consecutive day. According to the same source, the corpses of 39 people who were killed in the battles last week were found in the al-Rafai neighborhood. In the same context, Syrian state-run news agency Sana said a number of civilians and law enforcement members were killed and injured after being the target of a bombing in the countryside of Daraa last night.
The Syrian crisis has taken a new turn in light of the rising tension in many areas that have been at the front line of the confrontations of the past few months. However, the armed conflict in the neighborhood of al-Khalidiyya confirms that a military resolution to the Syrian crisis is still far from reach. In the city of Homs, al-Khalidiyya, and the entrances of various rebelling neighborhoods, including al-Bayada, al-Qusur, and al-Wa'ar, were the targets of violent shelling by regime forces after a large number of refugees from the neighborhood of Bab Amr fled there. The shelling led to a number of deaths and injuries. Meanwhile, dissidents fear the Syrian army will storm the neighborhood in search of wanted men.
وبالقرب من مفرق الجيزة على طريق بصرة المسافرة.
Near Al-Jiza intersection on Al-Basra Al-Musafira Street, a car bombing killed and injured a number of law enforcement members and civilians, according to Syrian state media. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights confirmed the bombing but did not provide any further details. In Hama province, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said armed groups of defectors launched RPG rockets on a regime armored troop carrier near the town of Kalat al-Madik, killing one soldier and damaging the vehicle. In addition, the violent shelling of Kalat al-Madik by regime forces led to a number of civilian deaths. Meanwhile, anti-regime protesters continue to take to the street in a number of Syrian cities and towns. Most notably, demonstrations were held at the neighborhoods of al-Sukri and Saif al-Dawla in Aleppo, which had previously distanced itself from the opposition's protest movement. According to opposition sources, anti-regime protests also erupted in the capital, Damascus, in solidarity with besieged and disaster-stricken cities.
The UN Security Council has adopted a statement on Syria affirming its great support for the efforts of UN Arab League Special Joint Envoy Kofi Annan to find a solution to the Syrian crisis. The statement called for implementing the proposals in Annan's report, including a ceasefire, releasing the detainees, and starting a national dialogue. The statement does not include any condemnation of the repressive measures which the opposition accuses Syrian President Bashar al-Assad of carrying out. For her part, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton demanded that Syria implement the international plan or face additional pressure.
Different Palestinian governorates witnessed demonstrations and sit-ins in solidarity with prisoners in the occupation's prisons, especially hunger strikers. In Tulkarm, a sit-in was organized in solidarity with Kifa Hatab, Hanaa al-Shalabi, and all prisoners in the cells of the occupation.
The weekly solidarity sit-in with Hanaa al-Shalabi, Kifa Hatab, and the prisoners' movement inside the occupation's prisons was attended by a large number of representatives from different commissions, public figures, and the families of the prisoners. Meanwhile, news from inside the occupation's prisons confirm conditions are deteriorating as a whole, but particularly for the hunger strikers.
The prisoners were attacked in Ashkelon. Some of the prisoners' bones were broken and others were beaten until they bled. The condition is very hard and tragic. They're examining the prisoners and they're strip-searching them. This is a blatant violation of the Palestinian people's dignity.
Calls are rising for the international and human rights communities to support the prisoners and ease their suffering, and pressure the occupation authorities to stop the repressive practices against the prisoners' movement, practices that contradict all principles and international conventions.
The international community, worldwide legislative councils, and parliaments must stand with the Palestinian prisoners. We must end all administrative detentions. It is illegal. It has been in place since British colonialism, and occupation forces are still practicing it against our prisoners.
ونناشد جميع المعنيين من حقوق إنسان
We call on all human rights organizations and countries to work hard to pressure the tyrannical Israeli government to end this injustice against our brave prisoners.
Prisoner Kifa al-Hattab is continuing his hunger strike for the 23rd consecutive day, demanding that he be considered a prisoner of war. He is calling for the implementation of the Geneva Convention for his case and those of all the prisoners.
My dad continues his strike for the 23rd day now. We are very worried for his life. We are calling on the world to intervene. We're hoping that the media and international pressure on Israel will push it to view him and the other prisoners as prisoners of war and that they get released from prison immediately.
Conditions inside the occupation's prisons indicate the prison's administration has violated the rights of the prisoners, as confirmed by family members and groups involved with the prisoners. Meanwhile, calls are growing for organizing the biggest popular solidarity movement in support of Palestinian prisoners. There are plans to embark on a daring historical move that will consist of general and open-ended hunger strikes if the prison's administration does not fulfill the demands of the prisoners' movement. A simmering anger prevails in the occupation's prisons as the prisoners continue to face the prison administration's repressive practices. This anger will explode at any moment. Moin Shadid, Palestine TV, Toulouse.
French Interior Minister Claude Guillaume said police are still surrounding the youth suspected of having carried out the attacks in Toulouse and Montauban.
French police said the suspect, identified as Mohamed Merah, a French national of Algerian descent, admitted to his affiliation with al-Qaeda. The police said he promised to turn himself in this afternoon. However, he cut off contact with the police shortly after.
Toulouse is restless these days. Its atmosphere is charged with raids and explosions. Armed policemen are surrounding the residential complex that witnessed multiple shooting incidents that targeted French soldiers and the Ozar Jewish school that killed 3 children and a rabbi. The raid targeted one person in a small apartment. The French Interior Ministry said the suspect admitted to having connections with members of the Salafi jihadist movement. His name is Mohamed. He's a 24-year-old French national of Algerian descent. Police said he was previously arrested in the northern Afghan city of Kandahar in relation to a civil case.
Since the 2 shooting incidents targeting policemen, this person has said many things and he admits to belonging to al-Mujahideen and al-Qaeda. He says he wants to avenge Palestinian children and retaliate against the French army's military interventions abroad.
Guillaume added that Mohamed's brother and his girlfriend, as well as his mother, were taken into custody as a precaution, and residents of the surrounded building were also evacuated. The French president asserted that Merah is the one who carried out the Toulouse and Montauban attacks.
I met with the Jewish community and representatives of the Muslim community to show that terrorism will not divide our society. I say to the French nation that we should not resort to retaliation, but should adhere to national unity.
Meanwhile, Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad called for ending such actions in the name of Palestine or claiming to defend the rights of Palestinian children who only ask for a dignified life. The Imam of the Mosque of Paris, Dalil Abu Bakr, warned of what he referred to as confusing Islam with these attacks, affirming that Muslims are completely integrated into French society. In Jerusalem, Israel held a funeral for those killed at the Jewish school. These developments come at a time as Paris is preparing to hold elections for a new president at the Élysée Palace next month.
Defense Minister Ehud Barak is meeting today with German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle in the second day of his visit. Earlier in Berlin, German Defense Minister Thomas de Maizière warned that a military escalation against Iran would bear unimaginable risks. But Barak said that Israel should keep all its options open and emphasized that Iran with nuclear weapons would be unacceptable to the entire world.
And I think that there is a growing understanding all around the world that the challenge of Iran turning into military nuclear power is a major threat, not just to Israel, but to the stability of the whole region, and through the crucial role of this region in the world energy supply, practically to the whole world.
It was released for publication today that the General Security Services arrested a Hamas terrorist last month who is suspected of planning to kidnap an IDF soldier and assist in a suicide bombing plot in Eilat. The man, identified as Mohammed Abu Adra from Rafah, was indicted today in the Beersheba District Court. He was caught trying to infiltrate into Israel along with several other Palestinians. During his interrogation, Abu Adra admitted that he underwent a thorough briefing in the Gaza Strip regarding how to gather information about potential sites for terrorist attacks. Joining us now from our Tel Aviv studio to talk about the latest information on the terrorist attack in France is Dr. Eli Carmon, Senior Research Scholar at the International Institute for Counterterrorism and Fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. Good evening, Dr. Carmon.
Good evening.
French authorities at first suspected that neo-Nazis were behind the attack on the Jewish school in France. Are you surprised that it now appears to be the work of Muslim extremists?
No, I'm not surprised. There were three alternatives, either al-Qaeda affiliated people, Iran, or the right-wing group, although I think a right-wing group was the lowest priority at the beginning. And then there appeared photos and, of the soldiers, and this gave the idea that perhaps they were responsible.
Dr. Carmon, how strong is al-Qaeda and other Muslim terrorist groups in France?
I think this is a classical example of homegrown terrorism. Although in France there were very few successful attempts of terrorism since 1996, but I must stress that although he is an Algerian and probably also his brother was involved in these attacks, they trained and prepared themselves in Pakistan or perhaps in Afghanistan, probably in Pakistan. And if you look to what happened in Britain since 2005, all the attacks or the failed attacks in Britain were organized by Pakistanis or they were trained in Pakistan. For the last 3 years, all the cells arrested in Spain were of Pakistani people which trained in Pakistan. So we have for the first time, I think, a case in France where also is the same pattern of people who are radicalized in France itself. They go to the front in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and there they are trained to attacks inside Europe or even the United States.
Have the French authorities been taking the right approach in combating Muslim extremist groups in France?
The French security forces and the police are considered to be very efficient. And as I said, until today, all the attempts of plans to attack targets inside France failed or were foiled. So this is the first time, I think, after 10 years, more than 15 years, that there is a failure in the security situation, especially the fact that he already killed 3 militaries, and it took 4 or 5 days until he produced the terrorist attack against the Jewish school. So there is a problem perhaps here to see why it took so much time in order to find him after the first 2 attempts.
أعلنت السلطات الليبية أن موريتانيا وافقت على تسليمها رئيس المخابرات السابق في عهد القذافي عبد الله سنوسي.
Libyan authorities announced that Mauritania has agreed to extradite Gaddafi's former intelligence chief, Abdallah al-Sanusi, who was arrested in the country. Libyan government spokesman Nasser al-Manna told reporters before leaving the Mauritanian capital that his country will soon extradite al-Sanusi to Libya, where he will receive a fair trial. Al-Manna added that there are legal procedures that must be respected, and it's only a matter of time before al-Sanusi is brought back to Libya. A Libyan delegation led by Deputy Prime Minister Mustafa Abu Shagur arrived in Nouakchott to demand al-Sanusi's extradition. Abu Shagur met with Mauritanian President Mohamed Weld Abdelaziz.
The first direct contact between Mauritanian and Libyan leaders since the arrest of former Libyan intelligence chief Abdullah al-Senussi by Nouakchott, a ministerial delegation led by Libyan Deputy Prime Minister Mustafa Abu Shagur met with Mauritanian President Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz. The delegation demanded Nouakchott to extradite what it described as the second most important man after Gaddafi to stand trial in Libya.
This man was the second most important person in Libya after Gaddafi. The Libyan people want to ensure that this man is extradited to Libya. He is Libyan, and the Libyan people want to see him and make sure he receives a fair trial in Libya.
France, Britain, and the International Court of Justice want to see Abdullah al-Senussi, better known as the keeper of Gaddafi's secrets, stand trial on a number of terrorism and criminal charges.
Al-Senussi will stand trial in Mauritania. He will not be extradited to Libya as mandated by UN charters. As far as the extradition treaties signed by France, they only apply to French citizens who were sentenced.
The man, who suffered a heart attack as leaked by news reports, was subjected to questioning by Mauritanian police amid a complete media blackout. It seems that civil aviation incidents dominated the list of charges al-Senussi is facing. Al-Senussi will be questioned over his role in the Lockerbie bombing and the bombing of a French aircraft. He will also be questioned over the disappearance of a Mauritanian plane that may have crashed or downed at sea in 1979. The Mauritanian Prime Minister at the time, Ahmed Ould Boussif, was on board that plane. It's highly expected for al-Senussi to be questioned over the fate of Imam Musa al-Sadr, who disappeared on Libyan territory. Regardless of the political and legal debate stirred by the arrest of Gaddafi's intelligence chief and secrets keeper, this case will be the first real test facing a state court in the Arab Maghreb region. Mohamed Abdulmani, Al-Alam, Nouakchott.
The head of Iraq's Civil Aviation Authority, Nasser Hussein, announced that on March 29th, Baghdad International Airport will only be receiving special flights for the Arab presidents and kings attending the Arab Summit in Baghdad.
Hussein confirmed in a phone call to Al Iraqiyya that the Iraqi airport will be open to all flights at all times, except on March 29th, when the summit will be convened. Missions that may be described as difficult await the Baghdad summit, most notably the Syrian issue, which will take the largest part of the summit's agenda.
Saudi political observers expressed hope that the summit will conclude with decisions that resolve the Arab disputes that have been intensively discussed in previous summits, but did not achieve any implementable solutions.
The anticipated Arab summit will be convened in Baghdad at the end of the month after the last withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. Saudi journalists expressed their views on the summit.
The upcoming Arab summit that will be convened in Baghdad is a summit full of challenges and difficulties, especially in light of the Arab Spring, which has brought a wave of change to a number of countries. I believe the most important challenge for the Arab summit in Baghdad is the Syrian issue. I believe the credibility of the summit and its success or failure will depend on taking a positive move on the Syrian issue, especially since the tides of the Arab Spring have arrived to Syria. Syria is at a historical turning point. It is crucial to take positive steps towards solving the crisis in the brotherly Arab country of the Syrian Republic.
The Arab Street is waiting for this Arab summit to issue decisive resolutions on the situation in Syria. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will participate in the summit at its highest diplomatic level due to the challenges the Arab world is facing. Faisal Al-Omar, Al-Iraqiyya, Riyadh.
President of the Kurdistan region, Masoud Barzani, said in a speech on the occasion of the Nowruz holiday that he will ask the people of the region to determine the fate of the region's secession if no proper solution is reached on the disputes with the federal government.
Many people contacted us requesting that we announce today the great news for the people of Kurdistan. Therefore, we reassure you the day is coming, God willing, for us to announce the good news. However, it should be at an appropriate time. But rest assured, this news is inevitable.
On the subject of the oil contracts, Barzani stressed that the issue does not lie in whether these contracts are constitutional or not, but that the federal government does not want to achieve any development in Kurdistan.
The oil and gas belong to Iraq, so why don't they refer the law to the Council of Representatives? Despite this fact, those people in Baghdad go crazy every time a company comes to sign a contract with the region because they know that what we are doing here is constitutional. The problem is not about whether these contracts are constitutional or unconstitutional, but the problem lies in that they cannot stand the achievement of any development in Kurdistan. They try to impede any development in the region.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincote Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic. Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.